Off the coast of northern Peru, 5 men boarded a modest fishing boat just before dawn on March 12, 2025. It was supposed to be a routine trip, 3 days at sea, netting fish, and then back to port with fresh catch for their families. The crew, a mix of Peruvians and Colombians, had done this countless times before. But this time, something went terribly wrong. Just 48 hours after departure, their only generator failed. No radio, no GPS, no power. Just the endless ocean and a rising sense of helplessness. No one on shore knew where they were or even if they were still alive. As the days turned into weeks, families lit candles. Some prayed. Some feared the worst. What happened to these men during those 55 days at sea would challenge everything you think you know about survival. Hit like, subscribe, and let's go. Julio Herrera was a quiet man of 42, a father of 2, and a fisherman since he was a teenager. Every morning before sunrise, he'd tie his worn boots, kiss his wife on the forehead, and head toward the docks of Paita, a coastal town in northern Peru. Fishing wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, something Julio took pride in. His boat, weathered and patched, had carried him through calm seas and sudden storms. That March morning felt no different. He packed extra rice, his favorite black coffee in a thermos, and an old photo of his children tucked in his shirt pocket, his little ritual for longer trips. As he pushed off from the shore with his crew, the horizon was calm, painted in soft blues and golds. No one aboard suspected this trip would be any different. But as the shoreline disappeared behind them, so did the quiet certainty of routine. Something was coming, just out of sight. 2 days into the trip, the ocean had been calm, almost too calm. The crew joked quietly, passing around mugs of lukewarm coffee as they pulled in a modest catch. Just after sunset, as Julio reached to check the navigation system, the screen went black. A faint smell of burnt plastic drifted from the engine room. Moments later, the dull hum of the generator sputtered and died. At first, no one panicked. It wasn't the first time equipment had glitched. They tapped buttons, checked wires, tried restarting it, nothing. The generator, their only source of power, was gone. Julio stepped out onto the deck, the breeze brushing against his face as he looked into the distance. No lights, no landmarks, just water in every direction. "We'll fix it tomorrow," someone mumbled. But deep inside, Julio felt it, a subtle shift. The kind you can't name yet, but it settles in your chest like a stone. Something was off. By the 4th day, the reality began to sink in. The backup radio, meant for emergencies, clicked uselessly when they tried to send a signal. The GPS was blank. The engine would sputter for a moment, then choke in silence. They were drifting, slowly, almost imperceptibly, carried by the current with no control. Food was still enough for a few days, and the men kept busy, patching nets and checking systems, convincing themselves this was just a delay. But the silence was growing heavier. Each night, Julio lay awake on the wooden deck, staring at the stars, trying to calculate their drift. No ships passed by. No lights on the horizon. Just endless dark water. They weren't in a panic, not yet. But the laughter had stopped. The coffee was gone. And when it rained, they started saving the water in old buckets. Just in case. Julio didn't say it aloud, but he knew they were no longer just behind schedule. They were lost. On the 7th day, the last of their drinking water ran out. The bottled supply was gone, and the tropical sun was relentless. Dehydration crept in slowly, cracked lips, dizzy spells, shallow breath. One of the younger crewmen, Sebastian, began talking to himself, delirious from the heat. That's when Julio made a decision. He gathered the crew, and together they rigged a tarp to collect rainwater, tying shirts and plastic bags at the corners to funnel even the smallest drops. But for 3 days, the sky stayed dry. In desperation, they tried something else, an old trick Julio had heard from his grandfather. He cut a piece of fish, salted it with sea spray, and chewed slowly to draw moisture, then spat it out. They also began sipping tiny amounts of seawater, just enough to wet their mouths, hoping to stretch the time. It wasn't safe. It wasn't wise. But it was that or nothing. This wasn't about getting home anymore. It was about staying alive. By the 2nd week, their bodies had thinned and their skin burned raw from sun and salt. Then came the realization that chilled Julio to the bone. Based on the stars and the direction of the current, they were no longer near the Peruvian coast. They had drifted west, far into the open Pacific. With no engine and no steering, they were completely at the mercy of the sea. Julio found an old map in the storage locker, damp and faded. He estimated their position. They could be hundreds of miles from land. Maybe more. Worse yet, the fish they relied on began to vanish. No more daily catch. The ocean, which once fed them, was turning silent. Julio sat alone at the stern that evening, watching the sunset melt into the waves. A sharp fear gripped him, not just for himself, but for the young men who trusted him. For their mothers, their wives, their children. He was the oldest. That made him responsible. On day 27, a storm rolled in from the west, swift, violent, and without warning. Waves crashed over the deck, tossing the boat like a toy. One of the crew was nearly swept overboard before Julio grabbed him by the arm and hauled him back. Their tarp tore in the wind and the last of their rainwater was lost to the sea. When morning came, the boat was barely afloat. Supplies soaked. Nets tangled. Everyone bruised and silent. That night, Sebastián whispered he couldn't take it anymore. He wanted to jump and swim toward somewhere. Julio grabbed his shoulders, looked him dead in the eyes, and told him, "We either live together or we don't live at all." Julio had a choice: keep the men calm with hope or tell them the truth that rescue might never come. But if he broke, they all would. He lay awake, heart pounding, wondering, what happens when faith runs out and there's only ocean left? By day 40, one of the men, a quiet Colombian named Marcos, stopped getting up. He lay curled beneath a torn tarp, eyes sunken, skin dry and pale. Julio tried to coax him to drink, to chew on fish or coconut scraps they'd managed to salvage from floating debris, but Marcos barely responded. That night, the others whispered fears no one dared say aloud, that they might lose him. Or worse, that they'd start losing each other, one by one. The boat was now little more than driftwood. Sharks circled in the distance some days. On others, the sun seemed crueler than ever. Julio felt himself slipping, his thoughts, his strength, his will. But then, a small miracle. Just before dawn, clouds gathered, and for the first time in days, it rained. Not a storm, not a downpour, but enough to drink, to feel cool water on their tongues. Julio closed his eyes and whispered, "We're not done yet." On day 55, as the sun broke through the morning haze, Julio spotted something faint, low on the horizon. A dark shape. Not a cloud, not a wave. A boat. He blinked hard, afraid it was another hallucination. But it grew closer. Real. A tuna vessel from Ecuador. They waved frantically with their shirts, voices hoarse from weeks of silence. When the crew spotted them, they pulled alongside and hauled the men aboard, thin, sunburned, but alive. Doctors later said they were hours from organ failure. Marcos, barely conscious, wept when given a sip of clean water. Julio sat on the deck of the rescue ship, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the endless blue one last time. He felt no triumph, just quiet gratitude. He hadn't saved everyone, but he hadn't given up. Survival, he realized, wasn't about strength. It was about holding on just long enough. And now, a question for you: could you survive 55 days at sea? What would keep you going? Months after the rescue, Julio no longer stepped onto boats. He stayed close to home in Paita, helping mend nets on shore or fixing engines for other fishermen. His hands still smelled of salt and oil, but the sea, once his daily companion, now lived in his memories, not his mornings. He spoke little of the ordeal, though the weight of those 55 days lingered in his eyes. At night, he sometimes sat outside, watching the ocean from a distance. His children would ask why he stared so long. He'd smile softly and say, just remembering how big the world is. People in town called him lucky. But Julio didn't feel lucky, he felt changed. He knew what it meant to be forgotten by the world and to return. If everything you depended on disappeared, what part of yourself would remain? And would it be enough?